Sarah Martinez had always been fascinated by medieval history and royal ceremonies. As a 28-year-old history teacher from Chicago, she had saved for 3 years to take this dream vacation to England. The highlight of her trip was supposed to be the guided tour of Windsor Castle, where she could finally see the famous ceremonial guards up close. The morning sun cast long shadows across the castle courtyard as Sarah joined the group of tourists gathering near the main entrance. She clutched her camera tightly, her heart racing with excitement. This was it, her chance to witness centuries of tradition in person. The tour guide, a cheerful elderly man named Robert, began explaining the significance of the castle's architecture and its role in British history. As they moved through the castle grounds, Sarah found herself mesmerized by every detail. The ancient stone walls seemed to whisper stories of kings and queens who had walked these same paths. Her eyes sparkled with wonder as she took countless photos, trying to capture every moment of this once-in-a-lifetime experience. When they reached the courtyard where the royal guard stood at their posts, Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. There, standing perfectly still in his brilliant red uniform, was a guard holding a ceremonial sword. The weapon gleamed in the sunlight, its ornate handle decorated with intricate engravings that spoke of centuries of royal tradition. The tour guide explained that these guards were highly trained soldiers who took their duty extremely seriously. They were not just for show, they were real protectors of the crown, selected from elite military units. The sword the guard carried was not just decorative. It was a symbol of his oath to protect the royal family with his life. Sarah listened intently, but her attention kept drifting to the magnificent sword. As a history teacher, she had shown her students countless pictures of such weapons, but seeing one in person was completely different. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and she could almost feel the weight of history it carried. The other tourists in her group seemed content to take photos from a respectful distance, but Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to get closer. She had studied these ceremonial swords in textbooks for years, and the opportunity to examine one up close was too tempting to resist. Her academic curiosity began to override her common sense. As the group moved on to the next part of the tour, Sarah lingered behind. She told herself she just wanted one more look, one more photo from a better angle. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he had been trained to do. His discipline was impressive, and Sarah admired his dedication to duty. The morning crowd was relatively light, and for a moment, Sarah found herself standing closer to the guard than any of the other tourists had dared to go. She raised her camera for what she planned to be the perfect shot, but as she did, something inside her shifted. The desire to simply observe transformed into something much stronger, an almost irresistible urge to touch history itself. Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly as she lowered her camera. The sword was right there, just a few feet away. In her mind, she began to rationalize what she was thinking. She was a history teacher, after all. She had spent years studying these artifacts. Surely just touching it for a moment wouldn't hurt anyone. She convinced herself that her intentions were purely educational. The guard continued to stare straight ahead, giving no indication that he was aware of her presence, though she was certain he must be. Royal guards were trained to be aware of everything around them while maintaining their stoic appearance. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she made a decision that would change everything. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah took her first step toward the guard. Her rational mind screamed warnings at her, but her curiosity had taken complete control. She moved quietly, almost tiptoeing as if approaching a sleeping giant. The guard's breathing was so controlled and steady that for a moment she wondered if he was even real, or perhaps just an incredibly lifelike statue. The ceremonial sword hung at the guard's side, attached to his uniform by an elaborate belt system. From where Sarah now stood, she could see every detail of the weapon's construction. The blade was polished to mirror perfection, and the handle bore the royal coat of arms engraved in gold. It was even more beautiful up close than she had imagined. Sarah's hand began to reach out almost without her conscious permission. Her fingers stretched toward the sword's handle, trembling with a mixture of excitement and terror. She kept telling herself that she would just touch it for a second, maybe feel the weight of it, and then step back. No harm would be done, and she would have a story to tell her students for years to come. Just as her fingertips were about to make contact with the cold metal, the guard's head turned with lightning speed. His eyes, which had been staring into the distance just moments before, now locked directly onto Sarah's face with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The movement was so sudden and precise that Sarah jumped backward, her hand snapping back to her chest. The guard's expression was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It was not anger exactly, but something far more powerful. A combination of professional authority, controlled fury, and complete bewilderment. His eyes seemed to bore right through her soul, as if he was trying to understand what could possibly possess someone to attempt what she had just tried to do. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Sarah felt frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The guard continued to stare at her with that same penetrating gaze, his jaw set in a hard line. The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension and unspoken consequences. Finally, the guard spoke in a voice so low and controlled that it was somehow more frightening than if he had shouted. His words were clipped and precise, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He asked Sarah what she thought she was doing, his tone making it clear that he expected a complete and honest answer. Sarah's mind went completely blank. All the explanations she had prepared, all the justifications about being a history teacher and her academic interest, simply evaporated under the weight of his stare. She stammered something about wanting to look at the sword more closely, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew how foolish they sounded. The guard's expression grew even more stern if that was possible. He informed Sarah that what she had just attempted was not only against regulations, but could be considered assault on a member of the Royal Guard. The seriousness in his voice made Sarah's knees feel weak. She had never considered that her actions might be viewed as an attack. Other tourists had begun to notice the commotion. A small crowd was forming at a respectful distance, their cameras now pointed at Sarah rather than the guard. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her, wondering what she had done to earn the guard's attention. Her face burned with embarrassment as she realized she had become the center of a very unwanted spectacle. The guard raised his hand slightly, and Sarah noticed that his grip on the sword had tightened. He hadn't drawn the weapon, but his body language made it clear that he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect himself and maintain order. The reality of the situation finally began to sink in for Sarah. This was not a museum display or a historical reenactment. This was a real soldier with real weapons and real authority. The guard took a single step forward and Sarah instinctively stepped back. His movement was fluid and controlled like a predator assessing a threat. The morning sunlight caught the polished buttons on his red uniform, and Sarah noticed for the first time just how physically imposing he was. His training was evident in every muscle, every careful movement that spoke of years of discipline and preparation. Sarah's mouth felt dry as cotton as she tried to form an apology, but the words came out as barely a whisper. The guard's expression remained unchanged as he listened to her stammered explanation about being a history teacher, about her fascination with medieval weapons, about how she never meant any harm. Each word she spoke seemed to make the situation worse rather than better. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and Sarah could hear whispers in various languages as tourists tried to understand what was happening. Someone was recording the incident on their phone, and Sarah realized with horror that her moment of poor judgment might end up on social media for the entire world to see. Her teaching career flashed before her eyes as she imagined the headlines and the shame this would bring to her school. The guard raised his hand to signal for silence, and the courtyard fell quiet instantly. His authority was absolute and unquestionable. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the space with military precision. He explained to the gathered crowd that attempting to touch or interfere with a Royal Guard's equipment was a serious offense that could result in arrest and prosecution. Sarah felt her legs growing weak beneath her. She had come to England for the adventure of a lifetime, and instead she was facing the possibility of being arrested in a foreign country. Her mind raced through the potential consequences: legal fees, deportation, losing her job, the shame her family would feel. All because she couldn't control her curiosity for just a few moments. The guard continued his explanation, describing the sacred duty that royal guards held to protect not only the royal family, but also the traditions and symbols of the monarchy. The sword at his side was not just a piece of metal. It represented centuries of service, sacrifice, and honor. To attempt to touch it without permission was to disrespect everything it stood for. As Sarah listened to his words, she began to understand the true magnitude of what she had almost done. This wasn't just about breaking a tourist rule or crossing a boundary. She had nearly violated something that held deep cultural and historical significance for an entire nation. The weight of this realization settled on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes as the full impact of her actions hit her. She thought about her students back home, how she had always taught them to respect history and treat artifacts with reverence. Yet here she was in one of the most historically significant places in the world, having nearly committed the exact kind of thoughtless act she warned her students against. The guard seemed to notice her distress, and for the first time his expression softened slightly. He could see that Sarah was genuinely remorseful and that her tears were real. However, his duty remained clear and he could not simply ignore what had happened. Protocol demanded that incidents like this be reported and handled according to established procedures. 2 additional guards appeared from nearby positions, having been alerted by some unseen signal. They approached with the same controlled precision as their colleague, their faces equally serious. Sarah watched them approach with growing dread, understanding that the situation was escalating beyond anything she had imagined possible when she woke up that morning. The original guard began to explain the situation to his colleagues in a low voice, using terms and procedures that Sarah didn't understand. She caught fragments of their conversation, words about protocols, reports, and supervisors. Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of what was supposed to be her perfect vacation. Sarah tried to think of something, anything she could say or do to make the situation better, but her mind was blank with panic and regret. She stood there in the morning sunlight, surrounded by centuries of history, feeling smaller and more foolish than she ever had in her entire life. One of the newly arrived guards stepped forward and politely but firmly asked Sarah for her identification. His tone was professional but left no room for argument. Sarah fumbled through her purse with shaking hands, her American passport feeling heavy and foreign in her trembling fingers. She handed it over, acutely aware that every tourist in the courtyard was watching her humiliation unfold. The guard examined her passport carefully, noting her personal information and tourist status. He asked her several questions about her purpose in England, how long she planned to stay, and where she was staying. Sarah answered as honestly as she could, her voice barely above a whisper. She explained that she was a teacher on vacation, staying at a small hotel in London, and that this was her first visit to Windsor Castle. The original guard who had confronted her began writing something in a small notebook he had produced from his uniform. Sarah watched nervously as he documented the incident, wondering what exactly he was writing and where that report would end up. The reality that this was becoming an official matter made her stomach churn with anxiety. The crowd of tourists continued to grow, forming a loose circle around the scene. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others judgmental. A few children in the group pointed at her, asking their parents in loud whispers what the lady had done wrong. Their innocent questions only added to Sarah's shame as she realized she had become a cautionary tale. The guard with her passport asked if she was traveling alone or with a group. When Sarah explained that she was part of a tour group, he asked her to identify her tour guide. Sarah looked around frantically until she spotted Robert, the elderly guide who had been leading their group. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, his face filled with concern and embarrassment. Robert approached when summoned, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by serious worry. He identified Sarah as part of his tour group and apologized profusely to the guards for the incident. The guide explained that he had clearly outlined the rules about maintaining distance from the guards and their equipment at the beginning of the tour. His disappointment in Sarah was evident, adding another layer to her growing sense of guilt. The guards conferred among themselves while Sarah stood in mortified silence. She watched their faces, trying to read their expressions and guess what decision they might reach about her fate. The conversation seemed to go on forever, though it was probably only a few minutes. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited to learn the consequences of her actions. Finally, the senior guard approached Sarah with a serious expression. He informed her that while her actions constituted a serious breach of security protocol, they were taking into account several factors. Her obvious remorse, her status as a first-time tourist, and the fact that she had not actually made contact with any equipment or person would influence their decision. However, he continued, The incident would still need to be formally documented and reported. Sarah would receive an official warning, and the report would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities. He made it clear that any future incidents involving royal guards or royal property would result in immediate arrest and prosecution to the full extent of the law. Sarah nodded vigorously, grateful beyond words that she wasn't being arrested on the spot. She promised repeatedly that nothing like this would ever happen again, that she understood the seriousness of her actions, and that she would spend the rest of her visit being the most respectful tourist in England. Her relief was palpable, though she knew this was far from over. The guard then delivered what felt like the final blow. He informed Sarah that she would be escorted from the castle grounds immediately and would not be permitted to return during her stay in England. The tour she had saved 3 years to take was over before it had really begun. Her dream of exploring every corner of Windsor Castle had been shattered by her own poor judgment. As the reality of being banned from the castle sank in, Sarah felt a new wave of regret wash over her. She thought about all the historical sites she wouldn't see, all the knowledge she wouldn't gain, and all the experiences she wouldn't have. The sword that had seemed so attractive just minutes before now felt like the most cursed object in the world. The walk toward the castle exit felt like the longest journey of Sarah's life. One of the guards escorted her while the others returned to their posts, the incident becoming just another part of their duty. Sarah's tour guide Robert walked alongside them, occasionally glancing at her with a mixture of disappointment and sympathy that made her feel even worse about the situation. As they passed through the courtyard, Sarah noticed how other tourists stepped aside and whispered among themselves. Some took photos of her being escorted out, and she realized that her moment of poor judgment would likely appear in vacation albums and social media posts around the world. The thought of being remembered, as that tourist who tried to grab the guard's sword, filled her with deep embarrassment. The ancient stone walls that had filled her with wonder just an hour earlier now seemed to loom over her in judgment. Every carved detail, every weathered stone seemed to whisper about the centuries of visitors who had come before her and managed to show proper respect. She felt like she had failed not just herself, but the very history she claimed to love so much. When they reached the main gate, the guard handed Sarah back her passport along with an official document detailing the incident and her ban from royal properties. He explained that this document should be kept with her travel papers, and that attempting to visit any royal residence during her remaining time in England would result in immediate arrest. The formality of it all made the consequences feel very real and permanent. Robert, her tour guide, spoke with her privately for a few minutes before she left. His disappointment was clear, but he also showed genuine concern for her well-being. He explained that incidents like this were incredibly rare, and that in his 20 years of leading tours, he had never seen anything quite like it. His words, though meant to be comforting, only made Sarah feel more isolated in her poor judgment. The guide also warned Sarah that news of the incident might spread quickly among other tour operators and hotel staff in the area. Windsor was a small community where everyone knew everyone, especially those involved in the tourism industry. He suggested that she might want to consider cutting her trip short, or at least staying away from other royal sites to avoid further embarrassment. As Sarah walked away from Windsor Castle, she felt completely lost and alone. The excitement and joy that had filled her morning had been replaced by shame, regret, and a profound sense of disappointment in herself. The castle grew smaller behind her, but the weight of what had happened seemed to grow heavier with each step. She found a small bench in a nearby park and sat down to collect her thoughts. The official document crinkled in her hands as she read it over and over again, trying to process the reality of what had happened. The legal language made everything seem even more serious and permanent than it had felt in the moment. Sarah pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long time, debating whether to call her family back home. How could she explain what had happened? How could she tell them that her dream vacation had turned into a nightmare because she couldn't control herself for just a few minutes? The thought of disappointing the people she loved most added another layer to her existing shame. She also worried about her job. As a teacher, she was supposed to be a role model for her students. What would happen if word of this incident somehow made its way back to her school district? Would parents trust her to take their children on field trips? Would her colleagues look at her differently? The professional consequences could potentially be just as serious as the legal ones. The morning sun that had seemed so bright and promising earlier now felt harsh and unforgiving. Sarah sat on the bench surrounded by the beauty of the English countryside, feeling more isolated and regretful than she had ever felt in her entire life. The sword that had captured her imagination so completely now seemed like the symbol of the worst decision she had ever made. As other tourists walked past her toward the castle, chattering excitedly about their plans for the day, Sarah realized that her relationship with history and historical sites had been forever changed. The innocence and pure joy she had felt when exploring historical places was gone, replaced by a painful awareness of boundaries and consequences. Days passed slowly as Sarah remained in London, but the city that had once seemed magical now felt foreign and unwelcoming. Every time she passed other tourists excitedly discussing their visits to royal sites, she was reminded of her ban and the opportunity she had lost forever. The remaining days of her vacation stretched ahead of her like a prison sentence, rather than the adventure she had planned. Sarah spent hours walking through London's non-royal museums and parks, trying to salvage something from her trip. But everywhere she went, she was haunted by the memory of that moment when she had reached for the sword. She replayed the scene in her mind countless times, imagining different choices she could have made, different words she could have said, different ways the entire situation could have unfolded. The weight of her actions became even heavier when she began to understand the broader implications of what she had done. Through research at her hotel, she learned about the sacred traditions surrounding royal guards and their equipment. She discovered that the sword she had tried to touch was not just ceremonial, but was a symbol of centuries of service and sacrifice by generations of soldiers. Reading about the history and significance of the royal guard made Sarah realized how deeply she had disrespected something that meant so much to so many people. The guards weren't just tourist attractions or living statues. They were real soldiers carrying on traditions that stretched back hundreds of years. Her attempt to treat one of their ceremonial weapons like a museum piece showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what she was witnessing. 3 days after the incident, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She returned to Windsor, not to attempt entry to the castle, but to write a letter of apology. She spent hours crafting the message, trying to find words that could adequately express her remorse and her newfound understanding of what she had almost done. In her letter, Sarah acknowledged that her actions had been thoughtless and disrespectful. She explained that as a teacher, she was supposed to set an example of how to honor and respect history, and that she had failed spectacularly in that duty. She promised that she would use this experience to teach her students about the importance of showing proper respect for cultural traditions and historical institutions. Sarah left the letter with the castle's administrative office, knowing that it might never reach the guard she had confronted, but hoping that someone would understand the sincerity of her remorse. The act of writing and delivering the apology felt like a small step toward redemption, though she knew it could never undo what had happened. The remainder of her trip was spent in quiet reflection and genuine learning. Sarah visited libraries and spoke with historians, not as a tourist seeking entertainment, but as someone trying to understand the deeper meaning behind the traditions she had witnessed. She began to see how her role as a history teacher carried a responsibility she had never fully appreciated before. When Sarah finally returned to Chicago, she was a changed person. The confident, enthusiastic teacher who had left for England had been replaced by someone more humble and thoughtful. She realized that her love of history had been somewhat superficial, focused more on the excitement and romance of the past than on the real human experiences and sacrifices that historical traditions represented. Back in her classroom, Sarah found new ways to teach her students about respect and responsibility. She shared her story, carefully edited to focus on the lessons learned rather than the sensational details, and used it to help her students understand why rules and boundaries exist around historical sites and cultural traditions. The incident at Windsor Castle became a turning point in Sarah's life. While she never forgot the shame and regret of that morning, she eventually came to see it as a painful but necessary lesson. She learned that true appreciation for history requires not just intellectual curiosity but also emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and deep respect for the people and traditions that keep history alive. Years later, Sarah would tell people that her trip to England taught her more about herself and about history than any textbook ever could. The sword she had reached for became a symbol not of her failure, but of the importance of approaching history with humility and respect. Though she never returned to Windsor Castle, she carried the lessons of that day with her forever, becoming a better teacher and a better person because of her moment of profound regret.